They told everyone I chose not to come. But what would you think if you found out your family secretly planned your sister's wedding without you, then blocked your number the night before I didn't expose them? I didn't chase them. 30 days later, the truth slipped out. My grandmother revealed the fear my mother had carried for decades, and that fear drove her straight to my doorstep in tears, begging for a chance she never gave me. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. They didn't forget me. They just didn't think I'd notice. My parents flew to my sister's wedding in Napa Valley, surrounded by flowers and laughter, while I sat in Seattle with my coffee growing cold, believing it was just another ordinary Saturday. When I saw the photos, I didn't cry. I just felt something inside me finally grow quiet. My mother said you always make things harder than they are, but maybe this time I made it simple. I let go. I deleted the group chat. Stopped waiting for an apology and whispered to myself, peace doesn't always come from being understood. Sometimes it comes from walking away. I'm Madison Hale, and this is how being left behind taught me how to come home to myself. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was a quiet Saturday morning in Seattle, the kind where the air feels damp before the rain actually starts. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to finish a layout for a client when my phone buzzed. The sound was ordinary, but what I saw on the screen wasn't. Someone had tagged me in a photo on social media, well, not me exactly, but in a post that included my family's last name. The first image that loaded made my heart stop. My sister Chloe Hale Miller was standing in a white lace dress under a canopy of string lights at what looked like a resort in Napa Valley, California. Around her were our parents, Rebecca and Edward Hale, raising champagne glasses, smiling like the picture of happiness. My aunt cousins, even family friends from church were there. Everyone looked radiant, full of life. Everyone except me. The caption read, "A perfect day for Chloe and Andrew." My hands froze over the keyboard. For a moment, I thought maybe it was an old photo, some engagement celebration I'd forgotten about. But then I saw the date on the post. Today. I zoomed in on the photo again, looking for any trace of myself. A seat with my name. Maybe a message that had gotten lost. Nothing. I checked the family group chat. Hale family. The last message was from 3 months ago. Mom sending a link to Chloe's bridal shower. I hadn't responded. No one had followed up. Outside, the rain began to fall softly against the window. I could smell the wet pavement even from the 5th floor. I turned down the jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker, the notes suddenly too loud, too cheerful. My laptop screen dimmed, my reflection hovering above the faint glow. I reached for the old family iPad I still used for Netflix. It was still logged into my dad's email. A notification blinked on the corner. Your Alaska Airlines flight confirmation. I tapped it open. 2 round-trip tickets from Seattle to San Francisco purchased 2 weeks ago. My chest tightened. They hadn't forgotten me. They had decided without me. I sat back, gripping the mug in both hands, the coffee now cold. I tried to breathe evenly, to not fall apart over something that, if I was honest, I had seen coming for years. But this was different. This wasn't being left out of a birthday dinner or ignored on a family group call. This was being erased from a milestone I should have been part of. I reached for my phone and dialed Mom. She picked up after 2 rings, her voice crisp, distracted. "I'm a bit busy, honey. Can this wait, Mom?" I said, my voice trembling despite the calm I tried to force. "It's Chloe's wedding today, isn't it?" There was silence on the other end, long enough for me to hear faint laughter in the background, the sound of clinking glasses music, somewhere far away. And beautiful. Then she sighed. "Madison, you always make things bigger than they are. We didn't want to create any tension on Chloe's special day. You understand that, don't you?" My throat burned. "You didn't want tension, so you just left me out." "Please don't do this," she said. Her tone hardened like I was a child again, overreacting. "We thought it was better this way. You've been distant. We didn't think you'd want to come." I let out a small laugh, sharp and humorless. "You didn't even give me the choice. Madison, She started, but I cut her off. You don't have to worry about it anymore, I said quietly. You won't hear from me again. There was another pause, then a faint, don't be dramatic. But I'd already ended the call. I set the phone on the counter next to the half-finished coffee and unfastened the silver ring I always wore on my right hand, the one Mom had given me on my college graduation day. I placed it gently beside the phone. For a long time, I just stood there, the ticking of the kitchen clock louder than the rain outside. By afternoon, the sky had turned a dull gray. Through the large window in my living room, I watched planes ascend and disappear into the clouds. Tiny dots swallowed by distance. Somewhere on one of those flights were my parents. Maybe flying back from the celebration, maybe still toasting Chloe's future. I sat on the couch, scrolling through the photos again. There was one of my dad giving a toast. One of Mom adjusting Chloe's veil. I zoomed in on Mom's face, her smile proud, satisfied, untouched by the absence of one daughter. I wondered if she'd even noticed the empty chair where I should have been. My phone buzzed with a message from Lydia, my coworker and friend. Hey, are you okay? Thought I saw something online about your sister's wedding. I typed back, I'm fine. I wasn't invited. Then I deleted it before sending. Instead, I opened my contacts, scrolled down to Mom, Dad family group. My thumb hovered for a second. Then I pressed delete contact. For each name, the screen flashed once and went blank. I closed the laptop, turned off the music, and stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the city glistening under a dim silver light. I wrapped my sweater tighter, breathing in the cool air. From somewhere above, another plane passed overhead, cutting through the clouds. I watched its blinking lights until they faded completely. My voice, steady and soft, rose in the quiet. They flew away, I whispered, and I stayed. And I'm not running after them anymore. The words hung in the air for a moment like something being released. Inside, the clock ticked past noon. The rain stopped. And for the first time that day, I felt completely, painfully still. I can still see the house the way it looked in the late 90s. A 2-story, blue-gray home just outside Seattle, with a maple tree that dropped red leaves all over the driveway. The smell of cinnamon and frosting still brings me back there. I was 10, standing on a chair in the kitchen, arranging candles on the homemade cake Mom had baked that morning. The balloons were already starting to sag when the phone rang. Mom answered, cheerful as always, and a second later, her voice turned bright with excitement. Chloe won the dance competition. We have to go, Eddie. She covered the receiver, her eyes darting to me for only a heartbeat. Sweetheart, we'll be back soon. Don't start without us. Okay. The door shut, the car engine started, and the sound of tires faded down the street. I watched from the kitchen window as they drove away, the frosting on the cake beginning to melt under the warm light. I lit the candles myself, just to see them glow, then blew them out without making a wish. That was the first time I learned what it meant to disappear quietly. At dinner the following week, Dad was full of stories about Chloe's trophy, how confident she'd looked on stage, how proud everyone had been. He lifted his glass of water toward her and said, Just like your mother, charming and fearless. I smiled politely. When I spoke, he turned to me and said, You should talk more, Maddie. People don't know what you're thinking when you're so quiet all the time. I wanted to say that I was thinking plenty, but the words got stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. After that, I found my refuge in the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with a slanted ceiling and a single window facing the woods. I filled the walls with sketches. Faces, colors, imaginary places that felt safer than the real one. The only person who seemed to notice was my grandmother Eleanor. She would slip me sketch pads and pencils saying, You don't have to be like anyone else to be loved, my little artist. Those were the only words that ever made me believe I could be seen. By the time Chloe was in high school, she was the golden child, always surrounded by friends, always in the spotlight. Mom was the volunteer coordinator at her school. Dad coached her debate team. I kept my head down, worked hard, got straight A's. When I brought home my acceptance letter to the University of Washington's design program, I thought maybe this will make them proud. Mom read the letter at the kitchen counter and sighed. Art, huh? It's not the most practical thing, Maddie. You could go to a community college nearby, study something stable. If you stay close, we can help you out. I remember staring at the refrigerator where Chloe's dance ribbons were pinned in neat rows. I already accepted, I said. She pressed her lips together. Well, I just hope you know what you're doing. That night I lay awake listening to the rain hit the roof, feeling both terrified and free. The next evening, I packed my bags quietly. Grandma came to my room with a small envelope. Inside was $50 and a note in her handwriting. Go make your world colorful. The bus station smelled like diesel and coffee. It was almost midnight when I boarded. The windows were fogged from the cold. I watched the neighborhood lights fade as we pulled onto the highway. The further we drove, the smaller my house became in my memory, like a painting seen from too far away. At one rest stop near Olympia, I stepped out to stretch. I could still hear Mom's voice in my head. If you stay close, we can help you out. The truth was, I didn't want their help anymore. I wanted distance, a space to find out who I was without being compared. When the bus rolled into Seattle at dawn, the city was wrapped in mist. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, all glass and gray water. I promised myself I would build a life that looked nothing like the one I'd left behind, but as I dragged my suitcase down the wet pavement toward the dorms, I caught my reflection in a shop window. I looked small, like the little girl blowing out candles alone. That image followed me for years, the one where the room is full of light, but somehow I'm still in the shadows. I thought distance would heal everything. I thought if I worked hard enough, built a new world, the old one would lose its power. I didn't understand then that some wounds don't fade with miles. They just learn how to hide deeper. Seattle became my new beginning, but a quiet ache settled in the corners of it, an ache that never truly left even years later on the day I found out my family had boarded a plane to celebrate my sister without me. By 2022, Seattle had become both my shelter and my cage. I'd lived there for almost a decade, long enough for the rain to feel like background noise and the skyline to feel like an old photograph. Most mornings started the same way: coffee from the corner cafe, the walk to Pacific Creative Agency, the familiar buzz of conversation as I stepped through the glass doors. The office was sleek, open plan, all white lights and polished concrete. People half my age hustled through with iced lattes and AirPods, pitching ideas about campaigns that would change the culture. I didn't need to change the culture. I just needed to make rent, and maybe feel proud of something once in a while. Harold Grant. Our creative director was in his 50s, a man who still carried a notepad instead of a tablet. He trusted me. If the Harbor Coffee campaign lands well, he told me one morning, leaning on my desk. You're next in line for art director. I smiled, trying not to let my face show too much. Thank you, Harold. I won't let you down. Didn't say you would, he said with a grin before heading toward the conference room. When he left, Lydia Tran rolled her chair over to my desk. Lydia was my age, Vietnamese-American, whip-smart, and incapable of whispering. Okay. Art director, she teased, spinning halfway around. When this deal closes, who are we celebrating with, your family? I laughed quietly. No one from home, that's for sure. She raised an eyebrow. Still no contact. I shrugged, opening the color palette on my monitor. It's quieter this way. Lydia's expression softened. Quieter isn't always better, you know. Sometimes it is. I said and turned back to my screen. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and mock-ups. My phone stayed face down, notifications muted. Around 7, I shut my laptop and left the office. Seattle's streets were slick from a passing shower, the neon reflections of coffee shops stretching across the pavement. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky had turned a pale lavender. Inside, the air felt too still. I kicked off my shoes, reheated leftovers, and sat at the small dining table facing the wall. The only photo frame there held a family portrait from 2010. 2010, Mom, Dad, Chloe, and me. I was standing slightly apart from them, the only one not looking directly at the camera. I turned the frame face down. I was pouring wine when my phone began to ring. The name on the screen froze me. Aunt Caroline Brooks. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since she'd sent a card for my 30th birthday. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but something in my chest said I should answer. Hi, Aunt Caroline, I said, keeping my tone light. Madison, sweetheart. Her voice was warm, almost nervous. I was just calling to check in. I heard about the wedding and thought, well, I just wanted to see if you were coming. I went still. The wedding. Yes, Chloe's, she said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It's in Napa this weekend. Everyone's been talking about it. Your mom said you might be too busy with work, but I thought I'd reach out anyway. I stared at the glass of wine in my hand, the room suddenly too bright. I wasn't invited, I said quietly. There was a pause on the line. Oh, she said softly. Rebecca told everyone you had a project due that you didn't want to feel out of place. I thought that sounded strange. I laughed under my breath, but it came out hollow. Yeah, that sounds like her. Sweetheart. I'm so sorry, Aunt Caroline said. I should have called earlier. I didn't realize. It's okay, really. My voice was even, but my fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. I'm used to it, she sighed. You shouldn't have to be used to something like that. I didn't answer. The rain had started again, pattering against the window. After a few moments, she said gently, You take care of yourself, Madison. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Thanks. Aunt Caroline, I appreciate it. When the call ended, I stood for a long time staring at the dark reflection of myself in the window. Somewhere miles away, they were probably dancing, laughing, drinking champagne under the same string lights I'd seen in the photos. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and saw a flood of work emails, deadlines, approvals, client feedback. I highlighted all of them and clicked mark as read. Then I turned off notifications completely. The silence that followed was almost peaceful. I sank into the couch and let my head fall back. My mind drifted to all the times Mom had said, You always make things harder than they need to be. Or when Dad had told me you could try being more like your sister. It wasn't the absence that hurt, it was the pattern. Sometimes being forgotten was easier than being remembered for the wrong reasons. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the sound, and the city lights flickered through the mist. I sat there until my wine was gone, until my phone battery died, until the apartment was wrapped in quiet. Only then did I whisper to the dark, as if anyone could hear me. Maybe this time I won't go back. Monday morning started like any other. Gray light seeping through the blinds, coffee too bitter inbox, already overflowing. By 9:30, I was halfway through revising a layout when Harold appeared at my desk. His expression was unreadable, the kind he wore when a client complained or someone in HR messed up payroll. Madison, he said, voice low, can you step into my office for a minute? My stomach tightened. Lydia glanced over from the next desk, eyebrows raised. I shrugged, pretending it was nothing, and followed him down the hallway. His office was neat as always, shelves lined with old advertising awards and photos of his golden retriever. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit down. I did waiting. He rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. I got a call this morning from your mother. For a second I thought I'd misheard. My mother. He nodded, hesitant. She said you've been under a lot of stress, that you're not sleeping, that you might need to take a break from work. The words hit me like a slap. She called you. She sounded concerned, he said quickly. I told her it's not really my place, but she insisted. Look, Madison, you've been great here, but this is complicated. Clients notice when a lead designer is distracted. I felt heat rush to my face. My mother, who hadn't spoken to me since the day of Chloe's wedding, had somehow reached across state lines to undermine the one part of my life that still worked. I'm not distracted. I said, my voice steady even as my hands trembled in my lap. I'm doing my job. I know Harold said raising both hands, but maybe she's right. Maybe some time off would help. From the hallway, Lydia's voice broke through. Are you kidding me? She pushed the door open without knocking. You're basing HR decisions on a phone call from her mom, Lydia. Harold started, but she cut him off. You have no idea what she's been through. You can't just... Lydia. I interrupted softly. It's fine. She turned to me, eyes blazing. No, it's not. Really, I said. I'll handle it. Harold looked between us, awkward and defensive. I didn't mean to upset anyone. Just think about it, okay? I nodded, stood, and left the office before Lydia could say another word. My hands were still shaking when I reached my desk. I opened my email, the cursor blinking on a blank draft. Subject line resignation. I typed fast before I could talk myself out of it. Harold, thank you for the opportunities and for believing in me. It's time for me to step away. Please consider this my 2 weeks' notice. I stared at the words, then added one final line. Thank you for trusting me, even if it was only in my work. I hit send before the lump in my throat could stop me. When I looked up, Lydia was standing there, arms folded. You didn't, she whispered. I did. I said shutting down my computer, she exhaled sharply. Madison. Don't let them win, I smiled, tired. It's not about winning. It's about walking away before I lose more. Harold caught up to me near the elevators. Madison. He said you're one of the best designers we've had. Don't make this decision out of anger. I turned to face him. I'm not angry. I'm exhausted. There's a difference. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. If you change your mind, the door's open. I appreciate that, I said, pressing the elevator button. But I won't. As the doors closed, I saw Lydia watching from down the hall, her eyes full of something between pride and sadness. Outside, the drizzle had turned to steady rain. The city looked washed out, reflective. I walked without an umbrella, letting the cold drops soak through my coat. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a call from Aunt Caroline. I didn't answer. By the time I reached my apartment, I was dripping. I tossed my bag on the couch, pulled off my coat, and sank into the silence. Somewhere between the sound of the rain and my own heartbeat, I thought about my mother sitting in her house, probably telling herself she'd done the right thing, that she'd helped. She'd reached into my life like a surgeon with dull scissors, cutting clumsy, convinced she was saving me. I opened my sketchbook, drew a single line across the blank page, and stopped. For years, I'd let her voice fill every empty space I had. Now, the quiet was mine again. The next morning, I returned to the office just to clear out my desk. No one said much, just awkward goodbyes and a few pats on the shoulder. I packed my notebooks, my pens, the photo of the design team from our last company retreat. On my way out, I looked once more at the hallway, long, narrow, washed in dull light from the rain outside. People used to say I was too sensitive, too fragile for this industry, for this world, for life itself. But standing there soaked and shivering, I realized they were wrong. I wasn't weak. I was simply too strong to keep pretending this didn't hurt. I took a deep breath, pushed open the glass doors, and stepped into the rain. The city swallowed me up cold and gray and wide open. The drive to Tacoma took less than an hour, but it felt longer. The sky hung low and colorless, the kind of gray that pressed down on you. Aunt Caroline lived in a small yellow house at the end of a quiet street, the kind with mailboxes shaped like little barns and wind chimes on every porch. I parked in front, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, watching the rain beat on the windshield. When I finally knocked, she opened the door with a surprised smile. "Madison, I didn't think you'd actually come. I needed to get out of the city," I said. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like chamomile and laundry detergent. "Come in, sweetheart. I just made tea." Inside her house was warm, cluttered, and alive. Family photos, crocheted blankets, the faint hum of an old clock on the wall. I sank into the couch as she poured steaming tea into floral cups. For a few moments, we just sat in silence, the rain tapping gently on the roof. She finally spoke. "I know things have been hard with your mother." I gave a small laugh. "That's one way to put it." Caroline stirred, her tea eyes soft. "There's something you should know. When you were about 2, your mother had a miscarriage. It was bad. She lost a lot of blood. They weren't sure she could have another child." I froze. I never knew that. She didn't want anyone to know. Afterward, she was different, always anxious, always clinging to what she had left. When Chloe was born, she poured everything into her. She was so afraid of losing her again that she didn't know how to love you without fear. I stared down at the tea, my reflection distorted in the amber liquid. So she punished me for being alive. Caroline shook her head. She didn't mean to. She just couldn't separate her fear from her love. She thought if she didn't get too close, she couldn't get hurt again. I looked up. "That's not love, Aunt Caroline. That's cowardice." She didn't argue. The clock on the wall ticked in the stillness between us. After a while, she rose and went to the cabinet. She returned with a small box of old photographs, bound by a rubber band. "Here," she said, handing them to me. The photos smelled faintly of dust and time. I flipped through them one by one. Chloe in her dance costume, Mom in her classroom, Dad at a company picnic. In almost every picture, Mom had her arm around Chloe. In one, you could just barely see me in the background, half hidden behind a curtain holding a drawing. I felt something tighten in my chest. "She looks happy," I whispered. Caroline nodded. She was in her way, but happiness built on fear is fragile. I put the photos down and leaned back. "You're defending her." "I'm explaining her," she said gently. "Your mother isn't cruel, Madison. She's weak, and weakness can wound just as deeply." I stared at the rain outside sliding down the window in crooked lines. Weak people still make choices. She made hers. Caroline didn't reply. The clock ticked on each second, stretching out. My gaze fell on a photo frame on the mantel, a picture of Grandma Eleanor smiling with her arm around me back when I was 7. I remembered her voice like a whisper in my ear. Don't wait for them to see you before you start living. Something inside me cracked. Caroline followed my eyes, then stood and went to a drawer by the kitchen table. She returned with a small cream-colored envelope, the paper yellowed with age. Your grandmother wrote this before she passed, she said quietly. Your mother kept it for years. She couldn't bring herself to open it. Last week she sent it to me. I think she wanted you to have it. My fingers trembled as I took it. The handwriting on the front was familiar, looped, elegant, warm. To my Madison. I slid my thumb under the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside. There were only a few lines written in black ink that had faded slightly. My dear girl, you cannot heal others by hurting yourself. Love them if you can, but never lose yourself trying to be understood. That was all. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed the letter against my chest, shaking silently. Caroline came to sit beside me, her hand resting gently over mine. It's all right to cry, she said. You've been carrying this for a long time. I nodded, unable to speak. After a while, I whispered, Why does it still hurt? Even when I understand. Because understanding doesn't undo the wound. She said softly, But it's the first step to letting it heal. We sat there until the tea went cold, the rain softening into a mist outside. The clock chimed once, 5 o'clock. Caroline stood and refilled my cup. But I shook my head. I should go, I said. Thank you for telling me. She followed me to the door. Madison, one more thing, she said as I pulled on my coat. Forgiveness doesn't mean going back. It just means you stop letting the past live inside you. I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll try. Outside, the rain had started again, harder this time. I walked down the quiet street, the cold drops soaking through my hair and coat. I didn't run for the car. I just kept walking, the letter clutched in my pocket, the ink already smudged from my hands. Each step felt like something washing away, a decade of trying to earn love, of mistaking silence for peace. By the time I reached the corner, the sky had opened completely, and the city lights blurred through the rain. I stopped, lifted my face to the downpour, and let it come. For the first time in years, I didn't try to hide from it. The apartment looked smaller once I started packing. My sketches leaned against the wall stacks of canvases and design books that had once made the space feel like mine now felt heavy like anchors. I boxed up my laptop, my markers, and the few pieces of furniture I owned that weren't from Craigslist. By evening, only the echo of my footsteps filled the room. I rented a cabin on the Oregon coast for a month. Not a resort or a curated Airbnb, just an old wooden cabin with chipped paint and a porch that faced the ocean. It was the cheapest listing I could find that still had Wi-Fi. When I told Lydia, she asked, You sure you're not running away? I smiled faintly. I'm not running. I'm breathing. The drive south took half a day. The closer I got to the coast, the thicker the fog became, curling over the road like smoke. When I reached Cannon Beach, I pulled over. The sea stretched endlessly before me, gray and alive. The scent of salt and wet sand clung to my hair. I walked down to the shoreline, waves crashing against my boots, and whispered to myself, I came here not to hide, but to breathe. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was streaked with pink. The place was smaller than I expected. One bedroom, a worn-out couch, a wooden table covered in scratches. The walls smelled of pine and thyme. Through the window, I could see another cabin a few yards away. It looked newer, freshly painted. The next morning, I carried my coffee onto the porch. The air was cold and sharp. I tried to set my cup down on the railing, but my hand slipped, and the mug tipped over, splashing coffee across the deck. Morning accident. A man's voice called from next door. I turned to see him, mid-30s, tall, wind-tousled brown hair, a few days of stubble. He was holding a rolled-up blueprint under one arm. Yeah, I said, flustered. Guess I'm already staining the place. He grinned. Don't worry. Old wood needs a little waking up anyway. I smiled despite myself. You must be my neighbor. Ryan, he said, walking closer and offering a hand. Ryan Blake. I'm an architect supposed to be restoring that cabin. He nodded toward his own. You here for vacation or exile? Something in between, I said. I'm Madison. He studied me for a moment, still smiling. Well, exile suits you. You've got that peaceful runaway vibe. We ended up talking for an hour, the kind of conversation that feels like it's been waiting to happen. He told me about growing up in Portland, about how his mother wanted him to run the family construction business, about the day he packed a bag and left without telling anyone. She said I was throwing away my future, he said, but I just wanted to design my own buildings instead of living in someone else's blueprint. I nodded slowly. I guess I'm doing the same thing, just with people. He tilted his head. Family. Yeah, I said. They built a house that never had room for me. Ryan didn't press. Then you're in the right place. This whole coastline is for people rebuilding something. That evening he came by with a toolbox. Your porch step creaks, he said. Can I fix it? I laughed. You really can't stop building things, can you? He shrugged. Old habit. Old. We ended up repairing more than the step. By sunset we had replaced a loose board, sanded the railing, and shared a couple of beers. Ryan was easy to be around. Quiet in the right ways, but never uncomfortable. Later, he asked if I wanted to help him rebuild the railing on his deck the next day. You seem like someone who needs to use their hands, he said. I'm more of a paintbrush person, I replied. But I'll try not to break anything. The next morning, the air smelled like salt and cedar. Ryan handed me a hammer. Every broken thing can be rebuilt, he said as we worked. The steady rhythm of hammering and the sound of waves mixed together into something almost meditative. When we finished, he helped me carry an easel from my car to the porch of my cabin. Now it's your turn, he said. Make something new out of this. I set up the canvas facing the ocean. The sky was low, heavy with clouds, but the water glimmered underneath. I started painting. Not the view exactly, but the feeling of it gray and blue and endless. When I stepped back, I wrote a line in the corner. Silence is not emptiness. It's space. As night fell, the town in the distance lit up for some local celebration. Tiny bursts of fireworks bloomed faintly above the horizon. Ryan came over with a blanket and 2 mugs of hot cider. We sat side by side on the wooden deck, the ocean murmuring below. He nodded toward the lights. You ever think about going back? I shook my head. No. He smiled, half curious, half understanding. Not even if they called, I looked out over the dark water. I already left, I said quietly. I just didn't need a plane to do it. Ryan didn't say anything after that. We sat there watching the last fireworks fade into the mist until the night swallowed the sound of everything else. The morning light was softer than usual, spilling through the mist over the ocean. I had been painting for hours on the cabin's deck, the waves below rising and falling like steady breath. The brush moved easily, blending shades of gray into blue. For the first time in months, I felt still. Then my phone buzzed on the railing beside me. Lydia's name flashed on the screen. Hey, I said, wiping my hands on a towel. Her voice came fast, uneven. Have you seen the news? Check your phone right now. My stomach tightened. What news? The Seattle Chronicle. They did some lifestyle piece on your family. The wedding. It's everywhere. I hesitated, then opened the link she texted. The headline read, The Perfect Hale Wedding, an American Family Portrait. Below it, a photo of my parents and Chloe beaming at the camera, the same shot that had made its way across social media months ago. The words underneath stung. The Hale family embodies grace, unity, and timeless family values. For a moment, I could hear only the waves. I scrolled down. The comment section was already alive. Strangers dissecting what they thought they saw. Beautiful family. I thought they had 2 daughters. Where's the other one? Maybe she's the black sheep. I set the phone down, exhaling slowly. Karma doesn't need help, I said under my breath. What Lydia asked. Nothing, I said quietly. Just poetic justice. She paused. You okay? I'm fine. You don't sound fine. I've been worse. We talked a few more minutes, mostly about work, before I told her I needed to finish the painting. She didn't push. She knew when to stop. After I hung up, I looked back toward the water. The tide was coming in, crashing harder against the rocks. Dipped the brush into black paint and drew a line through the middle of the canvas, a horizon divided cleanly in 2. Somewhere miles north in Seattle, I imagined the fallout beginning. Mom, at the church. Potluck, her friends passing her the casserole dish and asking in polite tones, Rebecca, dear, is it true? Madison didn't attend the wedding? Dad stepping in smoothly. Voice steady, Madison wanted space. She's always been independent. The smiles, the nods, the quiet judgment behind their eyes. By afternoon, I got another call. Dad's number. I almost let it ring out, but something in me wanted to hear his voice. "Hello, Madison," he said a little out of breath. "What's going on?" "What do you mean?" "The paper, the comments. People are asking questions. Your mother is upset. She says it looks like you're trying to make us look bad." I let out a short laugh. "I didn't write the article, Dad, but someone must have said something," he insisted. "Who told them about you?" I leaned against the railing, watching a gull dive into the water. No one needed to tell them. The absence speaks for itself. He was silent for a moment. "You've always been so literal. This family doesn't need more tension. Just tell me you'll fix it." "Fix what?" I said. My voice low. "The truth." "Your mother's exhausted," he said finally. "She hasn't slept since this came out." I felt my jaw tighten. "She made me tired my whole life, Dad. Maybe it's her turn to rest." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "You don't have to be cruel." "I'm not being cruel," I said, calmer now. "I'm being honest. There's a difference. I don't understand you anymore," he muttered. "You never did." I said softly. There was a pause, and then he hung up without saying goodbye. The ocean had turned dark by then, the horizon blurring with clouds. I stood there for a while, phone in hand, feeling the old ache return. Not sharp, just familiar. The kind of pain that doesn't scream, only hums quietly beneath everything else. Inside, I set the phone on the table next to the half-finished sketch of a broken chair I'd been working on earlier that week. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and salt. I imagined Mom at home pacing the living room, scrolling through her phone, seeing the comments she couldn't control. I imagined her staring at the photo of my graduation. She still kept somewhere the one where I smiled even though she'd barely looked at me that day. Maybe she was realizing that perfection always costs someone something. The rain started again, faint at first, then steady. I opened the window and listened. Ryan knocked lightly on the door a few minutes later, holding a small paper bag. "You forgot your brushes outside," he said. "Thanks," I said, taking it from him. He looked past me to the table, saw the phone, the painting, the mess of papers. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just dealing with ghosts." He nodded. The kind of nod that says he understood without needing to. "Well, don't let them take the view away," he said before heading back to his cabin. After he left, I picked up my phone again, stared at the black screen, then set it face down. The waves outside roared louder, colliding against the cliffs, relentless. I whispered to no one. Silence doesn't kill anyone. It just shows the truth. Then I turned off the lights and watched the reflection of the storm in the window until it became part of the night itself. The light outside had already started to fade when my phone began to buzz again. I was rinsing brushes in the sink, the smell of turpentine thick in the air. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me said to answer. The screen flashed Mom and Dad. A video call. I hesitated for 3 full rings before swiping. Their faces filled the screen side by side on the living room couch. Mom's lips were pressed tight, her eyes sharp but tired. Dad sat stiffly next to her, jaw clenched like he'd been dragged into this. "Madison," Mom began, her voice taut, every syllable controlled. "I don't understand why you're turning this into such a spectacle. We never said anything bad about you." I stared at them through the grainy image. "You don't have to speak badly about me, Mom." I said, my voice even. "You just have to forget I exist." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not fair. Neither was being erased," I replied. Dad sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Your mother only wants to keep the family's reputation intact. You know how people talk. This doesn't need to become some big drama." I let out a quiet laugh. Drama isn't made by the ones who stay silent. Mom leaned forward, frustration cracking her composure. "You've always had a way of twisting things to make yourself the victim." I tilted my head. Maybe because I was... Her tone hardened. "You're making your mother look like a fool in front of everyone." "No," I said. "She did that on her own. I'm just not covering it up anymore." For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of the ocean outside filled the silence between us. Dad finally said, "We didn't raise you to be cruel." "I'm not being cruel," I said softly. I'm being clear. Mom's voice rose, her anger breaking through. You've embarrassed this family. Do you have any idea how it feels to have people whispering behind your back, asking what you did wrong as a mother? I met her gaze. Now you know how it feels. She flinched, her face tightening. Dad's hand came to rest on her knee, a silent plea to stop. But she pushed on, voice shaking. You think cutting us off makes you strong? It makes you bitter. I'm not bitter, I said. I'm done. Her lip trembled, and for the briefest second I saw something flicker. Fear, maybe? Or loss? Then it was gone, replaced by that same defensive calm. You'll regret this. One day, she whispered. Maybe, I said. But not today. Before she could reply, I pressed the red button. The call ended, and the screen went black. I stared at my reflection in the glass, pale and still, then set the phone on the couch. My hands weren't shaking. I waited for the familiar sting of guilt, but it didn't come. There was only quiet. I sat there for a long time, the sound of the waves faint through the open window. The room felt heavy with something I couldn't name. I reached for my sketchbook on the table and opened to a blank page. With a pen, I wrote in neat, steady letters. The day I stopped, they started to be afraid. I closed the book and leaned back, listening to the rhythmic crash of the tide. A knock came at the door, just as the first hints of evening fog rolled in. When I opened it, Ryan stood there, holding a bottle of red wine and 2 mismatched glasses. Thought you could use this, he said. I smiled faintly. You have perfect timing. He stepped inside, glanced around the small cabin, his eyes landing on the phone still lying dark on the couch. Rough night, not rough, I said. Just quiet. He set the glasses down on the table. Quiet's good, but you look like you just won a few rounds with a ghost. Something like that. I poured the wine, handed him a glass. We sat out on the porch, the night air cool and salty. The stars were faint behind the haze, but the moonlight caught on the waves. Ryan took a sip and leaned back in his chair. You ever wonder if silence makes things worse? I thought for a moment. Sometimes. But lately it feels like the only thing that makes sense. He nodded. Fair. We didn't talk for a while after that. The ocean spoke enough for both of us. When the bottle was nearly empty, he turned to me. You seem different tonight. I am, I said. It's strange, but I think this is the first time I've felt peaceful. Like the noise finally stopped. He smiled. Maybe that's what freedom sounds like. Maybe, I said quietly. We watched the waves together, a steady rhythm of rise and fall, the moon pulling the water, the way family pulls memory. Relentlessly, even when you try to let go. After he left, I stayed on the porch, staring at the horizon until the sky turned the color of steel. My sketchbook lay open beside me, the ink on the page drying in the night air. They thought I'd run away. But sitting there with the salt wind in my hair and the taste of red wine still on my tongue, I realized something. I hadn't left them. They'd stayed behind. It had been raining for 3 days straight when Aunt Caroline showed up at my cabin. The gravel outside crunched under her car tires, the sound almost swallowed by the ocean wind. I opened the door before she even knocked. She stood there in a beige raincoat, holding a thick folder against her chest, like it might break apart in the rain. You need to see this, she said softly, switching from her usual warmth to something cautious, almost apologetic. She stepped inside, shaking the water from her umbrella. I led her to the small table near the window where we could still hear the rain. She placed the folder on the wood and slid it toward me. It's about your parents. I hesitated. What now? She took a breath. They've changed the will. Everything. Your father's investments, the Queen Anne house, even their retirement fund. It's all been transferred to Chloe and Andrew. I stared at her for a moment before opening the folder. Inside were pages stamped and notarized names written in neat blue ink. I flipped through, slowly scanning the legal language that confirmed what she'd said. When did they do this? I asked. Right after the wedding, she said. The attorney, Cynthia Morris. You remember her from the church. Handled it. It's all legal. I nodded, keeping my face calm. The words on the page blurred for a moment, but I blinked them back into focus. So they've made it official, I said finally. I'm not just invisible anymore. I'm non-existent. Caroline's voice was soft. They think they're securing the family legacy. They probably told themselves it's what makes sense. I closed the folder and looked out at the sea. The rain had turned the horizon into one endless gray. They can keep their legacy, I said. I don't need it. She frowned. You could challenge it, Madison. It wouldn't be hard to prove emotional coercion. I can call Cynthia. She'd have to answer questions. I shook my head. Taking them to court would drag me right back into their world. I've spent too long trying to leave it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sound of the clock ticked faintly from the kitchenette. Caroline's eyes searched my face, maybe hoping to see anger, maybe hoping for anything at all. Finally, I smiled. Small, tired, but real. They can have the house, the money, the heirlooms. I'll keep the one thing they never understood how to give. Peace. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You've grown stronger than any of them you know that I had to, I said quietly. It was the only way to survive them. When she left, the air felt heavier. I went back to my easel, staring at the unfinished painting of the ocean. The waves in the picture were frozen mid-motion, as if waiting for permission to move again. I dipped the brush into a darker shade of blue and let it spill across the canvas. Somewhere far away, I imagined my parents sitting in that Queen Anne house, the one with the ivy crawling up the porch, and the family photo wall that never changed. Maybe Mom was polishing the picture frames again, her way of keeping control. Maybe Dad was reading the paper, pretending not to notice the silence between them. I could almost see her picking up one photo in particular, my graduation picture. I'd been smiling, clutching my diploma the last time she'd hugged me in public. I pictured her thumb tracing over the glass, stopping at my face, before putting it down again. At that same moment, she'd probably been telling herself she'd done the right thing, that cutting me out was for the family's stability. But what does stability mean when the foundation is denial? Maybe she heard her neighbor, Mrs. Lawson, at the door that morning, Rebecca. The woman would have said cheerfully, I saw the article about Chloe's wedding. You must be so proud. Both your girls are doing well, I bet. And maybe Mom smiled politely, her lips twitching just slightly before she turned away, blinking too fast. Back at the cabin, the rain finally eased. I wiped my hands on a rag and glanced at the clock. It was almost 5. Lydia had texted earlier that morning, asking if I wanted to meet about a new project she was starting, a small creative studio, just her and a few freelancers. I'd said yes. An hour later, I was sitting across from her at a coffee shop in town. The place smelled like espresso and cedar. She slid a contract across the table. Partnership, she said. 50-50. We start small, take on clients who actually care about the work. I skimmed it, smiling. You trust me that much? I trust your silence, she said with a grin. It means you're thinking, not doubting. I signed without hesitation. When we finished, she raised her cup. To new beginnings, she said. To starting over without permission, I replied. We clinked cups. The rain outside had turned into a faint drizzle again, painting the windows in streaks of silver. On the drive back to the cabin, I thought about how endings sometimes look like freedom in disguise. My parents had erased me from their will, but in doing so, they'd given me what I'd wanted all along, a clean break. I pulled over at a lookout point above the cliffs. The sea below roared vast and merciless. I rolled down the window, the wind rushing in cold and sharp. They can keep their empire, I said aloud. The sound carried away by the wind. I just want my own life. The horizon was clearing now, a thin line of gold breaking through the clouds. I stayed until the last drops of rain slid off the windshield, until the world felt wide open again. It was late afternoon when Aunt Caroline came back to the cabin. The air smelled of wet pine and sea salt, the light outside already thinning into the gray before sunset. She stood in the doorway, her coat damp, a large envelope held tightly in her hands. Your mother sent this, she said softly. She asked me to deliver it. I hesitated, staring at the envelope as if it might burn. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Elegant practice, the kind she used for holiday cards and grocery lists. Did she say why? Caroline shook her head. Only that you deserved to read it. I took it from her, the paper's slightly wrinkled edges softened from handling. She lingered for a moment, uncertain, then quietly let herself out, leaving me alone with the sound of waves and wind. For a while I just sat there, tracing my thumb over the ink of my name. Part of me wanted to throw it straight into the fire, but curiosity, or maybe the last thread of something like love, made me tear it open. The first thing I noticed was the smudges. The ink had run in places, small drops that looked too round to be from water. I unfolded the letter carefully. Madison. There are no excuses left, only truths I was too afraid to face. I spent most of my life terrified of losing the people I loved, so I built a wall around that fear. I thought if I controlled everything, I could keep everyone safe. But control is a strange thing. It looks like love until it starts to suffocate. When people started whispering that I had abandoned you, I told myself they were cruel. But I see now. They weren't talking about the wedding. They were talking about years. About birthdays I missed calls I didn't return, ways I made you disappear to make my life look whole. I stopped reading the words swimming on the page. My chest felt tight, not from anger this time, but from the heaviness of finally being seen. Too late, but still. I kept going. I thought I was protecting myself from pain, but all I did was pass it to you. I made fear a habit, and habit turned into cruelty. I became the kind of mother I swore I'd never be. Cold, careful, and proud. When I heard your name on other people's lips again, I realized I had lost you long before I admitted it. I lost you while you were still here. The last paragraph was written smaller, as if her hand had trembled. If you choose not to come back, I'll understand. You don't owe me forgiveness or even acknowledgement. I just want you to know that I see you now. I always should have. There was no closing line, no love mom, just the abrupt end of a woman who finally ran out of defenses. I read it twice more, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where I kept the few things that still mattered. Grandma, Eleanor's letter, a photo of her in her garden, the silver ring I had taken off the day of Chloe's wedding. I set the box back on the shelf and sat there, my hands in my lap, listening to the quiet hum of the sea. When the door opened again, I didn't turn. Ryan stepped in, shaking the rain from his hair. "You've been quiet," he said gently. "Everything okay?" I looked over at the table where the letter still sat. My mom wrote to me. His brows lifted slightly. "That's unexpected. What did she say?" "That she's sorry," I said simply. "That she finally understands." He waited a beat. "Are you going to write her back?" I smiled faintly. "No." He tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because forgiveness isn't for her to know." I said, "And it's for me to feel." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's fair." We sat in silence for a while. The wind outside had quieted, leaving only the sound of rain sliding down the windows. I reached for the small candle on the table, a beeswax one I'd been saving since I moved here, and struck a match. The flame flickered weakly at first, then steadied, throwing golden light over the unfinished canvas beside it. On the easel a painting waited, soft strokes of blue and white forming the image of a woman walking toward the ocean. Her back turned to the viewer. Her hair was loose, her steps small but certain. The horizon ahead of her was wide open. Ryan stood behind me watching. "She looks free," he said. "She is." I whispered. I let the candle burn its wax, pooling slowly. The letter, the rain, the painting. All of it blurred together until it felt like one thing, an ending that didn't hurt anymore. When Ryan left, I stayed where I was, the flame's reflection dancing across the window. The scent of smoke and salt filled the air. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. For the first time, silence didn't mean absence. It meant peace. A year later, I found myself back in Seattle, the city where everything had fallen apart, and quietly rebuilt itself. The rain was lighter now, almost polite, brushing against the glass windows of SeaTac Airport as I rolled my suitcase through the terminal. The air smelled like coffee and jet fuel, movement, departures, new beginnings. I had just printed my boarding pass for New York when I saw her. Across the terminal, near the arrival gates, stood my mother, Rebecca Hale. Her coat was beige, her hair shorter than I remembered, streaked with more gray. She was scanning the crowd, probably waiting for Chloe's flight from Hawaii. I froze for half a second, the handle of my suitcase locked in my grip. I hadn't seen her in a year, not since that letter. I thought about all the ways I'd imagined this moment, dramatic, painful, maybe even angry. But instead, what I felt was calm. She turned and our eyes met. For a heartbeat, everything around us, the chatter, the footsteps, the noise, faded into something quiet. She blinked in surprise, her lips parting slightly. Then almost unconsciously, she took a step toward me. I didn't move. Her heels clicked against the tile floor as she crossed through the stream of travelers, her hand clutching the strap of her purse like a lifeline. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the apology she'd already written but never said out loud. I gave a small nod, polite but distant, in acknowledgement without invitation. The loudspeaker broke the moment. "Flight 218 to New York is now boarding at Gate 6A, my gate. I turned, slightly ready to go. Then I heard it. Her voice barely cutting through the noise. Madison. It was soft, almost swallowed by the announcements. My suitcase wheels stopping against the tile. For 3 long seconds I stood there, the sound of her voice pulling at something old and fragile inside me. But then I exhaled and started walking again. Behind me, I could feel her still standing there, suspended in the crowd that moved around her. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did for myself. As I handed my ticket to the gate agent, I glanced out through the large glass windows. The sky beyond was pale blue, streaked with gray, the kind of Seattle day that couldn't decide between rain and light. I thought of the candle I had lit that night in Oregon, the soft glow against the painting of a woman walking toward the sea. That woman had finally taken her first real step. Somewhere behind me, on the other side of security, I imagined my mother watching. Maybe she was remembering the first time she'd dropped me at an airport, the night I left for college. Back then she'd hugged me tightly, whispered to call when I landed. I never realized that was the last time she'd ever truly held on. The engines outside roared to life. Passengers lined up. I found my seat by the window and watched as the rain began again, fine and steady. Through the glass, the runway shimmered with light. As the plane started to move, I closed my eyes. I could almost see her still in the terminal, standing where I left her. Maybe she was crying, maybe she wasn't. It didn't matter. She had her letter. My silence folded inside it. When the plane lifted off the ground, tilted away, Seattle shrinking into patterns of gray and green, my chest felt strangely weightless. Like the air had made room for something new. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for leaving. Through the thin hum of the engines, my voice echoed quietly in my own mind. I didn't just leave them behind. I finally left the version of myself that waited for them to see me. Outside the window, the clouds opened to sunlight. Somewhere below, maybe my mother was still standing there, her face turned upward, holding the envelope I'd never answered. The ink of her apology would be fading by now, but I knew she'd keep it anyway, because that's what mothers do. The plane rose higher, the city dissolving into white mist, and I thought with a peace that felt earned, I finally flew, just not in their direction. 2 years later, the city I once dreamed of felt like home. New York had a pulse that never stopped, a rhythm I'd finally learned to match. The studio Lydia and I built together stood on the corner of a quiet street in Brooklyn, its windows tall, the walls washed in morning light. We called it Haven Studio, a place for people who wanted to create without apology. That morning, I arrived early. The air still smelled faintly of paint and fresh coffee. On one wall hung the newest piece for our exhibition, a large canvas titled "The Empty Seat." It showed a family gathered around a dinner table, every detail soft and luminous. But one chair was empty. The paint there left unfinished, the absence speaking louder than any face. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger, remembering how long it took me to paint it. How many nights I'd stopped halfway wondering if healing meant closing a door, or just accepting that it would always be open a crack. Ryan walked in carrying a set of light fixtures, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, a smudge of sawdust on his arm. He had been designing the interior of the studio for weeks, turning bare space into something that felt alive. "You've been up since 5 again, haven't you?" he said, smiling. "Habit," I replied. "It's the only time the city is quiet." He looked at the painting, tilting his head. "It's beautiful. Sad, but calm. Like you figured something out." "I didn't figure it out," I said softly. "I just stopped trying to fix it." He nodded. "That's a kind of peace." By 9, Lydia arrived clutching a clipboard and 2 coffees. "Big day," she said, handing me one. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Outside, the street hummed to life. The clang of subway grates, the low chatter of people heading to work. Through the window, I could see our banner fluttering in the wind. Silence Speaks, a collection by Madison Hale. Before the guests arrived, I sat at my desk for a moment, opening the small wooden box I kept tucked on the shelf. Inside were the things that had followed me through every chapter of my life. The letter from my mother folded neatly now. The photograph of Grandma Eleanor standing in her garden. A small card from Aunt Caroline that said, "You did it, kid." I placed them on the table in front of me. The sunlight broke through the window, washing everything in gold. For a long moment, I just looked at them, breathing in the quiet. I didn't feel sorrow anymore, just a steady warmth, like forgiveness had taken root without me realizing. I folded the letter again, slid it back into the box, and smiled. Ryan called from the other room. "Showtime." "You ready?" I stood, smoothing the front of my jacket. "I'm ready," I said. This is the first chapter no one else gets to write for me. The exhibition opened at noon. The studio filled quickly. Friends, colleagues, strangers drawn in by the soft music and the smell of fresh paint. Lydia introduced the collection, her voice confident and bright. "These works are about transformation," she said. "About how silence isn't emptiness, it's space." People wandered through the gallery, pausing at the empty seat, some whispering, some simply staring. I stood near the back, watching them, watching how art could hold what words never could. At one point, Lydia joined me, linking her arm through mine. "You realize this is it, right?" she said quietly. "You built a life from the pieces they left behind. I didn't rebuild it." I said I built something new. Across the room, I caught Ryan's eye. He was adjusting the lights above another painting, his careful precision grounding me in the present. He smiled when he noticed me watching, and I smiled back. When the event began to wind down, I stepped outside for a breath of air. The sky had turned a warm amber, the city bathed in that fleeting golden hour between noise and night. I walked slowly down the street, the hum of New York rising and falling like the tide I used to listen to in Oregon. I thought about the day my parents flew to Chloe's wedding without me, about how that absence, once unbearable, had become the starting point of everything that followed. They had taken flight, and so had I, just in opposite directions. Their world had been about appearance control belonging. Mine had become about peace, honesty, and choice. The wind caught my hair as I crossed the street, the sunlight flickering through the tall buildings. Somewhere behind me, laughter spilled from the studio. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. In that moment, I realized I wasn't carrying the past anymore. It was simply walking beside me, quiet, unthreatening. I looked up at the city and thought, they flew to my sister's wedding and left me behind. I cut the ties, and I never looked back, and I meant it. The last of the sunlight faded the sky, glowing orange against the skyline. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and started down the block, the sounds of the city folding into a soft hum around me. Sometimes leaving isn't revenge, it's recovery. And if you've ever chosen silence over anger, you'll understand. Thank you for listening.